So for this first lecture on history, we're going to be going over the basics of history. And before we go through this lecture, I just want to remind you or let you know that there are 3 attendance questions for this history lecture. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Let's go to our picture of the day. So in this picture, here we see American privacy under attack by the United States wiretapping and bugging. And what's interesting about this political cartoon is that this was from 1970, over 40 years ago. Now take a second here and think. Are there any correlations between what was happening in 1970 and what is happening today? Very likely your answer is yes. Because you see, today the National Security Agency, the NSA, they're engaged in warrantless searches where they can monitor our cell phones and internet traffic. So something that caused so much controversy in the past is happening again today. And that's the reason why I start with this cartoon, because it highlights a common saying. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. If we don't recognize the mistakes from our past, then we're prone to repeat those same mistakes in the future. And this is one reason why we study history. And that's the reason why we're going to be studying 20th century U.S. history in this course. So with that, let's go to the goals for today's lecture. We're going to do all things history, setting up the basics for our history lectures. We'll first look at what is history. From there, we'll look at why we study history. And lastly, we'll finish with theories of history, going over patterns of historical development, and we'll look at variables that cause a change in human relations within our society. As for the last bullet point, we won't be discussing this. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Let us first focus on what is history. So once again, just take a second here and think about what history means to you. When you think of history, what do you think of? Alright, well in this case, history, as a definition, is the analysis and interpretation of the human past that enables us to study continuity and change over time. That is to say, history is the attempt to explain how people have changed over time and why they've changed the way that they did. It's the study of how people change and why they change over time. And that leads us to our next question. Why do we study history? So again, take a second here and think about why we study how people change and why they change. Why do we care about analyzing the past? Well, ultimately, I'd say there's a few reasons why we study history. The first of which is, studying history helps society to better understand itself in the present today. Right? We study the past to gain a better understanding of our present society. And studying the past allows us to see why our society is structured or acts the way that it does. It can explain why our government institutions are set up the way that they are, why certain laws exist, why we view ourselves in a particular way, in a particular identity, and why certain problems exist in our society. This is why Winston Churchill stated, "The farther back you can look, the farther forward you're likely to see." Point is, understanding the past helps us better understand our current lives. One major reason we study history. And another major reason why we study history is because history can teach society lessons for the future. Specifically, history can teach us lessons on what we should or shouldn't do. Right? We can see what was a success or a failure in the past, which can give us a better understanding of what we should do in the future if placed in similar situations. For instance, for myself, in the past, I have learned that when I'm going to cook, I need to have a mitt or an oven glove in my hand. Because yes, it has happened to me where I had an oven glove in my right hand, but then what did I do? I took my left hand and put it into the oven to grab the pan, and I burnt my hand. Stupid decision, stupid mistake. But what I learned from that history, what I learned from the past, is if I'm going to use the oven, I need to have an oven glove in both hands. That's a lesson that I've learned from the past. So in this context, right, for our U.S. history, if a policy has worked in the past, well then it stands to reason that there's a high likelihood of that same policy working in future situations. Or if a policy didn't work in the past, then it stands to reason that there's a high likelihood of that same policy not working in the future. In many ways, this is to quote Cicero, who stated, a famous philosopher, he stated, "History is the teacher of life. History provides us with lessons that we can apply in our own lives." And with that in mind, history also teaches us lessons on what can happen if we fail to act. Understanding history can help us better understand the consequences of our actions if we fail to implement those lessons. And this is to quote Santayana, a famous Spaniard who stated, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." If we fail to learn the lessons that history can teach us, then we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes again into the future. If I couldn't learn that lesson about wearing that oven glove, well then I'd be burning my hand again tomorrow, and the next day after that, and the next day after that. So ultimately then, this is why we study history. And this is why in this course we're going to be studying U.S. history in 20th century America. What we're going to do is see how America's past has shaped or impacted our society today. We're going to look at what lessons we can learn from these historical events, and if we can apply those lessons to today's society. And before we move on and look at our next section, looking at the patterns of historical development, I want to stop here and look at our first attendance question for the day. So, for your first attendance question, what I want you to do is to explain to me one lesson that you have learned from your past experiences. Tell me one lesson you've learned from your past experiences. Could be academic, could be personal, could be related to business, right? Any lesson will do. And with that, let's go back to our lecture and continue on. So we've looked at why we study history. Let's now switch gears here and talk about patterns of historical development. So when it comes to patterns of historical development, there are theorists of history that attempt to look for patterns in humanity's past. And these patterns can help explain why events happen the way that they do, which in turn will give us an understanding of what is happening in our society today and what will likely happen in the future. So take a second here and think of some common patterns that emerge when you think about historical development. What are some typical patterns that you see happening in our society based upon your historical analysis? Well, I would say that there are likely three predominant patterns of historical development that theorists have identified. We'll go through each in turn, and I will provide you with examples for each. And let's go and start with the first pattern, that being of circularity, where human history is just simply a series of repetitive rises and falls. So in many ways, this is the belief that history is simply doomed to repeat itself. And the reason why it repeats itself is because this is simply how natural entities operate. For example, think of the changing seasons. We have a spring, summer, fall, and winter every year. That's circularity, just repeating itself. Or we have the Earth going around the sun every 365 days, right? Circular repetition. Or think of the circle of life. I think of Lion King. For every life, there's a birth, a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end, a death. And through that death sows the seeds for future life. But of course, beyond just these natural examples, I want to give you some examples in humanity. For example, we have the Greeks' theory on government, the ancient Greeks' theory on government. And for them, just as they believed there are cycles of life and death in living organisms, that there too exists cycles of life and death in governments. In this case, they believe that there are cycles of authoritarianism and democracy in a human society. That is to say, that governments naturally ebb and flow between these two extreme poles. For instance, we have rule by authoritarians, by dictators, that provide us with security. But they eventually become corrupt, become a tyrannical minority, and in turn that leads to the people overthrowing that regime. And they instate a democracy, rule by the people. But rule by the people eventually turns corrupt, right? That too eventually leads us into mob rule. And this mob rule tears us apart. It pulls us into anarchy that undermines our security. So ultimately, because of that, a strong leader eventually comes bubbling up to take that society over again, to provide that country with security. And in turn, the cycle starts anew once again. And this ultimately, this belief in the birth and death of nations, this belief is exactly what our America's founding fathers believed in. They believe that no system of government can last forever. It has a beginning and an end. So their goal was to ultimately try and create a government that could last for a long period of time, to exist in perpetuity. That's why they created that system of checks and balances, to try to preserve the system as long as it could. As another example of this circularity, one that we're going to see in this class, we're going to see an ebb and flow between America's public interest versus that of its private interest. To highlight this point, let's go to this next slide. In 20th century America, we see this ebb and flow between these two poles. For example, in the late 1800s, we were predominantly within the private interest, right, with this belief in laissez-faire economics, meaning that there shouldn't be any regulations on businesses, and the protection of private property by limiting eminent domain, right, stopping government from seizing our property. Right, these policies favored individual private interests over that of the general welfare, primarily by limiting the government's control in our lives, in our economic lives. However, by the time we hit the Great Depression, we transitioned to being more concerned about the public interest, promoting greater regulations on businesses, and a redistribution of wealth through programs like Social Security, unemployment benefits, and Medicaid. See, all of these government regulations favored the interests of the general public over that of the private interest, precisely by increasing government's control within our lives. However, by the time we hit the 1980s, we started to swing back to the private interests, right? Deregulation, limiting government control in our life. We see this ebb and flow in 20th century America between these two poles. So these two examples of ancient Greece and America gives credence to the theory that human history is just one of circularity. Of course, there are other patterns of history beyond just this. For example, another common pattern of history is that of progress. That all of human history, in a sense, is leading us towards an ideal end. This progression can be linear and irreversible, something that Kant believed in, or this progression can be a series of rises and falls, but it will eventually reach its destination, its ideal. This is something that Marx believed in. Of course, the question arises. It begs the question, what are we as a society progressing to? Right, if you believe in this theory of history, take a second here and think about what ideals we as a human species are progressing towards. Take a second and think about this. Let me go ahead and give you some examples that I have. For example, perhaps what we as a species are progressing towards is individual freedom, where every single person on this planet has autonomy and control over their lives. Or maybe the end goal is happiness, the pursuit towards a higher quality of life, a higher standard of living for everyone on this planet. Maybe the ideal end that we're striving towards is reason. That is to say, to have a complete understanding of our universe and a complete understanding of why we're here. Or one final example could be maybe we are progressing towards civilization, where all of human history is one of developing out of a state of nature, where we are at the mercy of our environment, to an advanced civilized society, one that has complete control over its surroundings, where we submit nature to our will. These are all examples of progressing towards an ideal end. And let me go and give you an example of just that within our American government. The example in this case would be liberal democracy. See, according to political scientist Fukuyama, in his book, The End of History, he believes, his theory is that human history is leading us towards the ideal end of a liberal democratic society, where everyone lives within a democracy, where everyone lives in many ways within a type of democracy we have here in this country, where we believe in the principles of individuality, human rights, and capitalism. And he gives evidence to suggest just this. Let's go and look at his evidence to highlight that maybe this is the ideal that we're striving for. If we go to this data here, right, this is why he believes what he does. According to the Freedom House Index, in 1972, there were only 40 liberal democratic systems throughout the world, whereas there were over 60 authoritarian regimes. However, slowly but surely over time, we see more and more liberal democracies pop up and fewer authoritarians, to the point now where there are more democracies than there are dictators. And if we take this back even further in time, if you look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that in 1800 there was only one democracy, that being the United States, and over time we see more and more democracies emerge. This would be evidence for Fukuyama to suggest that our society is progressing towards this ideal end. An ideal in which all people live in a free society, a democratic society. Of course, this isn't the only pattern of history. There's one final pattern of history I want to discuss, and it's the exact opposite of progress. In this case, that would be regress, regression. The viewpoint that history is in decline. So with that, let me go and give you an example of this belief that actually we're in regression. For instance, if we look at our human intelligence, between 1884 and 2004, IQ levels in the Western world have dropped by 14 points. And the question becomes, well, what explains this? Take a second here and think about, why is it that our human intelligence is in decline? Or why it might be in decline? Some examples or some explanations that I can think of could be possibly due to technology. Right? Because of technology, we no longer have to remember anything, since all the information is already on the internet, available at our fingertips. And as a result, we're losing our intellectual skills. Or if you've ever watched the movie Idiocracy, the reason why humans are in decline is because smart people have kids less often than stupid people. And eventually that leads us to a society where all that's left are stupid people. That's their explanation. And let's actually go ahead and look at this clip from YouTube to highlight why this researcher believes why we are declining in human intelligence. Let's go and watch this clip.
You can't triple stamp a double stamp. You can't triple stamp a double stamp, Lord. You can't triple stamp a double stamp.
Are humans getting dumber as a species? Stanford University professor Gerald Crabtree's research into humankind's intelligence suggests that due to the low level of competition for basic necessities in the modern world, the best and brightest aren't the only ones naturally selected for survival and procreation anymore. Civilization and modern medicine allow for even the dumbest and most physically unfit to survive and pass their genes on to the next generation. In the distant past, survival wasn't so easy. The Darwinian concept of evolution dictates that only the people who could navigate the complexities of life on Earth would be able to live on and provide for their offspring. Crabtree says, new developments in genetics, anthropology, and neurobiology make a clear prediction that our intellectual and emotional abilities are genetically surprisingly fragile. When comparing genomes of parents and their children, it turns out that there are somewhere between 25 and 65 DNA mutations between each generation. Other scientists oppose Crabtree's ideas, saying that there is no real way to test his theory. What do you think? Are humans getting dumber due to the conveniences of modern life?
So we see that this theorist believes that the reason why we are in decline is because of genetic selection. And our intellect developed in order to survive. But as our society began to live in more supportive, high-density societies like in cities, and had access to a steady supply of food due to technology, well then genetic selection became more relaxed. Survival was no longer a primary concern, and so our genetic selection has waned. And with that, our intelligence is also devolving slowly. This political cartoon kind of highlights that very point. We are evolving into chairs. So there's an example of regression. Another example of regression could be that of societal collapse. And where our technologies are not progressing us towards an ideal, but rather they're progressing us towards our own destruction. Let me go and give you one example of that. In this case, of Easter Island. See, Easter Island is an island way out in the Pacific Ocean. And at the height of its civilization, it had a population of about 15,000 people. But by the 20th century, that population had dropped to just 2,000 inhabitants. And the reason why it wound up collapsing is because of resource depletion. Because it had too large of a population, it had wound up depleting all of its resources on that small little island. And because that it was so far away from the mainland, well, they didn't have the ability to move to any other island to survive. And that led to an overwhelming majority of their population being wiped out. In fact, we found evidence of cannibalism in Easter Island, where people were eating each other to survive. This small little example of Easter Island can show us that resource depletion can undermine a civilization. And of course, the fear today is that this resource depletion is happening on a global scale. See, there are currently 7 billion people on this planet, and estimates are that the human species is consuming 1.5 Earths per year. That is to say, it takes 1.5 years for the Earth to replenish what we as humans consume in just 1 year. And those projections are going up. The United Nations projects that by 2030, it's going to take Earth 2 years to replenish what we consume in just 1. In fact, just as a piece of evidence for you, according to the UN, if everyone consumed as we Americans did, it would take 5 Earths to sustain our way of life. So the point here is that if history is any indicator, our resource depletion can lead us to societal collapse. In many ways, think of Earth like that little island in the Pacific Ocean. Earth is the only place that we have to live. It's the only place we know. And if we consume all of its resources, our civilization is doomed to collapse. So, we can see here, I've given you many different patterns of historical development: circularity, progress, and regression. As you can see, at each of these theories of history, they arise from particular values and beliefs, our own lenses on studying the past. And with that, these different theories lead to different interpretations of why events have happened in the past, as well as different conclusions as to how these events have shaped society today and how our society will be shaped in the future. So for this class, what we're going to be looking at, again, is American history. Looking to see where you think, based on your values and beliefs, where you think America has been progressing towards an ideal, where you see us in decline, and where you think we're repeating history, stuck in that circular model. So with that, before we continue on and look at historical determinism, I have your second attendance question for the day. With that, let's go back to our attendance questions and look at the second one I want you to answer. So based on these historical patterns of development, circularity, progress, and regression, I want you to please provide me with one example of where you see progress, circularity, or decline in our society. And give me an example beyond the ones that I've given you in class. So again, based on these patterns of historical development, please provide one example beyond the ones I've given you of where you see progress, circularity, or decline in our society. And with that, let's go and continue on with our lecture. So we've looked at these patterns of historical development. Next up, I want to look at historical determinism. You see, beyond those patterns of history, there are also disagreements over primary variables that drive human history forward. That is to say, there are disagreements over the variables that lead to change in human societies, whether that change be progress, decline, or circularity. See, in many ways, historical determinism believes that there is some motor behind all of human history, some variable or variables that are able to explain what causes a change in human relations, for the better or worse. That is to say, events are bound by some form of causality. Certain conditions produce certain results. And these variables are the reasons why we see a change in human relations. So this historical determinism is trying to figure out what those causal variables are. Doing so can help us better understand why events have unfolded the way that they have, and it gives us more power to control our own destinies, to again avoid those mistakes from the past. And there's many examples of variables that can cause a change in human relations, in who we interact with and how we interact with them. So just go and take a second here and think about some examples of variables that cause a change in human relations. Take a second and think of some examples. Well, let me give you some examples that I have. There's many of them, many of these motors of history. One common example would be that of science and technology. Right? For those that believe in progress towards an advanced civilization or towards reason, they believe that science and technology is the motor that's driving humanity towards that ideal end. And they see that progress as a good thing. For example, 100 years ago, we didn't have cell phones or the internet. But because of that technological development, that has now changed who we interact with and how we interact with them, opening up the pool of people that we can talk to. Most of us consider that to be progress. Of course, based on your values and beliefs, you could say that actually this technology is leading us into regression. For instance, because of all these technologies, we aren't talking to each other anymore. Rather, we're texting each other. We're IMing each other. We're losing that human interaction because we're interacting with a computer, not a human being. Kind of like what we're doing right now in this classroom. So you could argue that technology isn't progressing us towards an ideal. Rather, it's the motor of history that's regressing us, causing us to go into decline. You see, that really is dependent upon your values and beliefs. As another example of variables that can change human relations, we have that of economic transactions. There are those, such as Marxists, who believe that it's economic transactions that are the driving force of history. That ultimately what drives history forward is the pursuit to acquire raw materials, to build products, and to engage in trade with others. For example, 3,000 years ago, we traded with each other through a bartering system. You had something I wanted, I have something you want, and so we trade with each other. But that's not how we interact with each other today. Right? What we use now is money. In fact, we don't even use money anymore. We use credit cards to buy things. And as a result of us taking on debt because of credit cards, we now have $1 trillion in debt from student loans alone. As you can see, economic transactions wind up impacting how we interact with others and who we interact with. That's the driving force of history, moving history forward, again, either towards progress or towards regress, or maybe just circularity. Could be any of the three. Another primary variable could be that of conflict. Right? There are theories that argue that conflict between human actors, that's the real driving force of history. It's conflict that upends the status quo and changes relations between human beings. For example, we have many state conflicts or wars that break out in the international arena. Whoever winds up winning those wars, they control how the society is to be structured into the future. To the victor goes the spoils. For instance, in World War II, in many ways you can consider this one big fight between democracy and authoritarianism. And whoever won that conflict would determine how we interact with each other and who we interact with. Right? If Hitler won World War II, then our society would look very different than it does today. There would be few, if any, democracies throughout the world. So ultimately, perhaps it is conflict or war that is the driving force of history, changing who we interact with and how we interact with them. And again, this driving force could be progressing us towards an ideal. Maybe we go to war in order to spread democracy abroad. Perhaps this could be leading us into decline, right? Perhaps wars lead to just ultimately death and destruction for us all, could lead to nuclear war, killing us all. That's regression. Or perhaps wars are a model of circularity. We have been fighting each other since day one, and we continue to fight each other till this day. Perhaps we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. It all depends upon your values and beliefs and how you are analyzing or interpreting these historical events. Another variable that can cause a change in human relations could be the great actor theory. And this theory basically highlights that history is simply the biography of a few central individuals, or heroes, that change how people interact with each other. That is to say, there are people that are highly influential due to their personal charisma, intelligence, wisdom, or political skill. And because of their superior skills, they are able to have a decisive impact in how we interact with each other. For example, take a second here and think of some great actors, great individuals that have caused a change in who we interact with and how we interact with them. So some examples that I have would include people such as Jesus Christ. Right? Regardless of your stance on if he is the Son of God, what we can say definitively is that this person has caused a huge change in human relations over the past 2,000 years, impacting what we believe, impacting how we interact with each other, and impacting who we interact with. Other people could include Martin Luther King Jr., more recent examples, causing a change in how we interact with people and who we interact with within the United States. Thanks to Martin Luther King Jr., we had the Civil Rights Movement that eventually ended segregation in this country, promoted equal rights, and ultimately led to our first African American president. Right? He was very influential in changing our society. Of course, these great actors don't have to be quote-unquote good people. They can also be infamous. They can be very controversial. They can be really negative, hurting our society instead, such as Hitler. And he, too, is a great actor. He caused a change in human society. And because we were able to defeat him in World War II, we realized the need to create a United Nations, the need to create NATO, to create these international organizations to try to stop these sorts of conflicts from breaking out into the future. So all of these people have caused a large change in our society. So perhaps it's these great individuals that are the driving forces of history, again, leading us towards progress, decline, or just some form of circularity. And lastly, the one I want to focus with you on, a variable that can cause a change in our society, is power itself. It's those that have power that cause a change in society. And to highlight this point, let's go and read a quote from George Orwell, who states, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Now, there's 2 points that he's getting at here. Let's first look at the first phrase. Who controls the past controls the future. You see, what he's getting at here is that whoever has the power today, they're going to have influence over how they set up society in the future, impacting who we interact with and how we interact with them. And this power is very amorphous. Right? This power can be economic, political, or social power. And that's ultimately going to be the driving force behind history. Those who have power impact the future. But beyond this phrase, let's now look at the next phrase. Orwell continues and says, "Who controls the present controls the past. And what he means by this is that who has the power today has the ability to reinterpret the past. To understand this, right, think of history as just a story that one is telling. And when you tell a story, you can change that story. You can modify the story. Right? History is open to reinterpretation because of changing values and beliefs, changing how we analyze the past. And this is ultimately what is known as historical revisionism, where those with power will reinterpret the past, retell the past in a different way to fall more in line with their own ideological perspective, where they'll reinterpret the past to highlight their successes while simultaneously downplaying their failures, all in the effort to construct that story, the story they want to tell. And at an extreme, it is an attempt to highlight, in this case, a government, a civilization, or a group as the greatest on earth. That all of human history has been building up to this greatest civilization of all time, that being itself. And every single country does this, including our own. In this case, the way that our government does this, and again, all governments, is they'll use their propaganda, like movies, pictures, posters, to retell past events in a certain way that glorifies us. Or think of, as just one example, think of Independence Day, right? Aliens came to destroy us, and who saved the day? The United States. That is telling a story that we are the greatest country on earth. Or they do this through national landmarks like museums, statues, libraries, right? Trying to show how great we are as a country. Or they'll do this through education. They'll rewrite history books and indoctrinate children to understand historical events in a particular way, to highlight the past events that showcase a country's greatness, while ignoring or glossing over parts of history that highlight that country's flaws or weaknesses. All of these are a brief sampling of examples of how those with power use that power to revise history, to showcase how great their country is. And the example I want to give to you here of this is our case here in America, where we have this belief in American exceptionalism, this belief that we are a city upon a hill, the shining example of civilization, that we ultimately are qualitatively better than every other country on this planet. But beyond just that belief, American exceptionalism believes that we have a unique role in the world to spread democracy throughout the world. And we have seen a retelling of these past events here in America that highlight that storyline, to try to construct that storyline of us spreading democracy throughout the world. For example, when we talk about World War II, we oftentimes retell that part of history for the United States, because that fits in line with our belief in spreading democracy abroad. It ties in line with that storyline of American exceptionalism. We fought valiantly against dictatorships. We fought hard against Hitler to protect democracy. And we make sure, through our propaganda, through our education system, to really emphasize that. At the same time, though, we oftentimes gloss over the parts of American history that go against the storyline of spreading democracy abroad. Right? We oftentimes gloss over the fact that when we engaged in manifest destiny to spread our country to the Pacific Ocean, that we murdered millions of Native Americans, driving them from their lands. Or how during the 1900s we engaged in American imperialism, where we overtook other countries like Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, Hawaii, We took them over by force because we were spreading democracy abroad. To them, they didn't see it that way. They saw subjugation. Or here's one more example. We have the Cold War. Right, during the Cold War, we oftentimes forget that the United States actively overthrew democratically elected governments and instated dictators to fight against the Soviets. That is not us spreading democracy abroad. That is us undermining democracy, as this political cartoon highlights. American exceptionalism. We side with freedom in the Middle East, except if it's bad for Israel, except if it's bad for oil companies, except if we like the dictator, if we appointed the dictator, if the revolution fails, or if radicals are elected. Right, these parts of American history, they are ignored or glossed over because they don't fit with our historical storyline that those with power are trying to tell. That we as a nation have always tried to spread democracy. So ultimately then, as I told you earlier, history is open to reinterpretation. And given that I hold a position of power in this classroom, I have my own interpretations and understandings of history. But just because that's the case, it doesn't mean that I'm right. So I encourage you to challenge my interpretations of history and provide your own interpretations and why you think your analysis is more accurate. So we see power not only helps construct future events, but it also reconstructs past events, retelling those stories in different ways. And with that, let's go ahead and have our final attendance question for this lecture. So for your last attendance question, I want you to explain what historical revisionism means to you, based on what you've learned in lecture. Right, this is a difficult concept, so I want you to reiterate in your own words what historical revisionism means. And with that, let's go back to our slides. So, to conclude this section, what we're going to be looking at in this course is to look to see if we can find the variables within the United States that have caused a change in human relations, changing who we interact with and how we interact with them. Because if we can find those variables, once again, that can give us a better understanding of why events have happened the way that they have, why events are happening the way that they are today, as well as how events will likely unfold into the future. And with that, let's go ahead and have our summary and get you out of here. So for this history lecture, we looked at why we study history. The reason we study history is to understand how past events have impacted our society today, as well as to understand how past events can teach society lessons for the future. And from there, we looked at a philosophy of history. We looked at patterns of historical development, and we looked at variables that can cause a change in human relations. So with that, we're all done. Be sure you answer those 3 attendance questions that I've embedded within this lecture and send me those answers via email by the specified due date on the assignment due date checklist. And with that, we're all done. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you next time.